Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. On today's episode of Podcast for Inquiry, I will be speaking with Dr. Mariam Mufti, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Mariam studies the politics of hybrid regimes with a particular focus on the role of the military, political parties, and identity in the processes of recruitment and selection of the political elite in Pakistan. She has published over 25 articles in peer-reviewed journals and has authored monographs on democratic development, political parties, and religious extremism. In keeping with her interest in undemocratic hybrid regimes, she has also appeared in a 6-part series, The Dictator's Playbook, on PBS, and How to Be a Tyrant on Netflix. In our conversation today, Mariam and I discuss the various waves of democracy over the past century and the backlash to them. We talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how democratic countries have united against it, at least so far. We discuss what has led to the recent decrease in trust in public institutions and why democratic voters support authoritarian leaders like Bolsonaro, Modi, Erdogan, and Duterte. Miriam provides suggestions on what citizens and countries can do to protect democracy, and she does her best to convince me that, despite recent setbacks, democracy around the world is not a lost cause. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoy this episode of Podcast for Inquiry. Mariam Mufti, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and particularly today, we are recording this on Wednesday, March 2nd, and our topic today is the state of democracy in the world, and it is a topic that is more current and more urgent than pretty much any other in the history of the Podcast for Inquiry so far. Now, I want to start with something that I read in one of your papers. And in your articles, you mentioned that the third wave of democracy ended in the 1990s. And we'll get to current events shortly. But let's start with the third wave of democracy that ended in the 1990s. Can you define for me and our listeners what the various waves of democracy are and what characterized them?
Right. So the three waves of democracy was a conception that was popularized by well-known political scientist Samuel P. Huntington in a Journal of Democracy article back in 1991. And he claimed that there have been three waves of democracy. The first wave being the slowest of them all in the 19th century, when countries such as the United Kingdom, the United States, and so on democratized, along with some Latin American countries. Then that was followed by the second wave after World War II, when a number of countries decolonized and emerged as democracies. And then the third wave, which was around the 1970s, when Southern European countries like Spain and Portugal, several Latin American states, and also a number of states in Asia democratized. Now, in my article, I said that the third wave of democracy ended in the 1990s because what we see happening in the 1990s is this rise in hybrid regimes. Now, let's just think about this conception for a second. The three waves of democracy. These three waves of democracy are also interspersed by reverse waves. And so what we have seen is that democratization in the 19th century was followed in the 20th century by the period of the Great Depression and the rise of fascism that led to World War II. Then the second wave of democracy was followed by another reverse wave in the 1960s, when a number of these countries, because of militarization of politics and military coups, became authoritarian states. And then similarly, the third wave of democracy also sort of undergoes a kind of reverse wave, where a number of the countries that emerged as democracies post fall of USSR, took a turn towards authoritarianism, right? Many of the Central Asian republics, such as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and so on, became authoritarian at this point in time. And then a number of scholars would argue that in 2010, the Arab Spring was perhaps another wave of democracy. Now, there are some political scientists that have counted as many as 13 waves of democracy. So I think the point that listeners should take away from this is that there is such a thing as world historical time, and politics is cyclical. And that is partly what I think Huntington was trying to get at.
Okay. You mentioned there's waves and then reverse waves. So is this just a circle that where there's some democratization and then we lose some democracies and then there's the rise of authoritarianism and then there's a bit of a rise? Or is there an overall trend, like between the first and I guess with the Arab Spring, arguably a fourth wave of democracy over the course of a little over a century in your timeline here? Are authoritarian regimes becoming more common, or hybrid regimes becoming more common? Or after each wave, are the reverse waves smaller? They're real. But is it like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, and democracies are increasing in prevalence? Overall, ups and downs, but the trend is up, or the ups and downs, but the trend is toward more democracies over the long haul, even though there are non-trivial downturns.
Right. So I would argue that there isn't any distinct pattern in that I would say, oh, a wave of democracy is X number of years and it's followed by a reverse wave that is X number of years. That is to say that the magnitude of the waves is not necessarily something that I want to define in any accurate way, because really the world is complex and there's a number of factors that need to be taken into account when we try and identify these waves. But what I will certainly say is that if we look at a number of indices that measure democracy around the world, we are certainly better off right now. Therefore, the trend is upwards. There are many more democracies in the world today than there have ever been in world historical time. Just if we compare to the onset of the third wave back in the 1970s, there were 3 times more authoritarian regimes than there were democracies. And if we compare that to a situation right now, presently, we would see that we're pretty much at par. There's a significant number of hybrid regimes out there in the world, about 50%, you would say. So at par with the rest of the world, which is 50%, well, democracy. So even though we seem to be at par, there are still many more democracies in the world than there've ever been. So the trend is upwards.
So let's cast our minds back about 30 years or so. In 1989, November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and then the Soviet Union collapsed a couple of years later. Now, while nominally a democracy, Russia, I would say, is anything but. It does have elections, but I don't think it would be accurate to characterize them as free, as either free or fair. And in recent years, Russia has expended a lot of effort in bringing the former Soviet republics, most of which were part of the Commonwealth of Independent States, closer to it by increasing diplomatic ties and economic dependence on Russia, on these former Soviet republics. Now, as we record this, it's March 2nd, 2022. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Are we seeing a demise of democracy in the region and a de facto rise of a second USSR?
It's too soon to say. I don't think we're seeing a demise of democracy in the region. After all the democratic states in the region, aka NATO, have come together to try and put pressure on Russia by imposing these sanctions that are having an impact slowly, but they are having an impact on Russia's economic capacity to continue to escalate this war. Now, Russia isn't giving up. Russia is continuing down this path, and in fact, many more troops have been posted to Ukraine. Putin, it seems, is escalating the war by making references to his nuclear arsenal. We don't know at this moment in time what could happen and how other countries, the alliance, the NATO alliance, is going to respond to Putin's continuous escalation. Now, bear in mind, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and therefore Article 5 does not obligate NATO to come to the rescue of Ukraine. But I will say, when you say the broader region does include countries that are NATO members, and NATO will very quickly come to their defense. The other thing that I would say is that, yes, Putin might have this vision of trying to export his form of governance to other like minded states. And one could say that the alliance between Viktor Orban in Hungary, or with Putin, or the alliance with China, which has also most recently been cemented with Putin's visit to China, and the meeting between Xi Jinping and Putin is to say that perhaps this new authoritarian alliance means that democracy is at risk. But at the same time, this authoritarian alliance is being counteracted by Western democratic states. Had we had this conversation, I think, when Donald Trump was the president of the United States back maybe a few years, maybe in the middle of 2018, I don't know how strong NATO's response would have been, because Donald Trump, as the president of the United States, had weakened NATO considerably with the kind of foreign policy that he was pursuing. Since Joe Biden has been elected to the presidency of the United States, one of the things I would say that Joe Biden has been successful in doing is reiterating United States' commitment to NATO and strengthening the NATO alliance, which has, I would say, come out quite strong against the response by the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, and has been unified in its stand when imposing sanctions against Russia, to the extent that we've even seen neutral Switzerland taking action, Germany going back on its deal with Russia regarding gas. So I wouldn't go so far to say as there is a demise of democracy in the region.
Let's stay on that for a moment. You mentioned Germany. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline was set to open and was about to. And as you mentioned, Germany, kind of at the last minute, as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, canceled, or at least postponed, the opening of that pipeline. But when it comes to the vast imports of energy from Russia that were already underway, Germany has decided, at least so far as of today, not to decrease or stop any energy imports from Russia. And I'm wondering, does that, in your mind, show a true determination against Russia to truly isolate it, or just doesn't want to give additional rewards or additional dependence on Russian energy?
Look, I think it's very simply to say that the world is economically integrated far more than it ever has been, again, in the history of time. And economic dependence does include some of these authoritarian states, Russia and China to be specific. And if Western states, Western democracies are dependent on these countries to be, the markets that they rely on for certain goods and for certain commodities, that does not necessarily mean that were Putin to continue to escalate this war and for Putin to attack a NATO member in the region, that NATO would not respond in equal measure. So I don't necessarily think that we should be confusing economic dependencies that have been that are, I would say, a lot stronger thanks to globalization and the integration of the world economy, to be confused by the resolve of Western democracies to react to authoritarian threats by a strongman like Putin.
Let's talk a little bit more about NATO, which is not an economic organization, but a political and military alliance. And you accurately noted that Ukraine is not a part of NATO. Now, Ukraine has asked to join NATO, and it was something that Russia has made explicit. Prior to the invasion, one of the things that Putin said as a absolute requirement was a commitment that Ukraine never join NATO. What is your perspective on having countries that border Russia joining the NATO alliance? And is that a good idea? Or is it, as Russia claims, a provocation to even consider having countries like Ukraine join the NATO alliance?
I mean, my own view is that if a country is sovereign, a sovereign country should be allowed to determine whether or not they want to be a part of a political or military alliance. Now, but politics is a lot more complex than that, and if Putin wants to put pressure on neighboring states and preventing them from joining NATO, well, has he been successful in all cases? So, for instance, I think if Putin were to threaten Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, NATO would respond. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't think that Putin is able to put pressure equally on all neighboring states in a uniform way. Some countries have been successful in joining NATO, and so, like I said, if we believe in the principle of sovereignty, these countries should be allowed to determine for themselves whether or not they can join a political military alliance. By the same token, NATO can sit and determine whether or not it wants to include these countries in the NATO alliance and risk provoking a leader like Putin.
Let's take a broader perspective on democracies and authoritarian regimes in the world today. I got the sense a few minutes ago that you seem to think that democracies are sort of on the rise, although not universally, not everywhere. Freedom House, which has published an annual Freedom of the World report for about 5 decades now, it called its 2021 edition Democracy Under Siege. The cover article of the December 2021 edition of The Atlantic is entitled "The Autocrats Are Winning." So there's definitely a surge of authoritarian regimes. My question is, at least to start, what causes people to reject democracy and embrace authoritarian regimes? And I'm thinking in particular in places like Turkey and Hungary and Poland, which have been democracies for some number of decades and are electing really anti-democratic and explicitly authoritarian governments.
So let's think about, one of the key differences between authoritarianism and democracy. In a democratic regime, public consensus, deliberation over policy making are absolutely key. The principle of representation is absolutely key. In an authoritarian regime, these principles are not necessary. Establishing public political consensus, deliberating over policy, and making sure that public opinion is on your side, and furthermore, the principle of representation is certainly not the linchpin of an authoritarian regime. Therefore, when you think about decision making, authoritarian regimes do have the advantage of being able to make very, very effective, quick, unilateral decisions that may appear to be more efficient than, say, a democratic regime. Okay, point number one. Point number two, and I think this is the kind of argument that economists like Ronald Wintrob have made regarding authoritarian regimes, is that there seems to be less waste in an authoritarian regime compared to democratic regime. Now, this is a really, really hard one to wrap your head around, in that in an authoritarian regime, the idea is that the middleman is cut out, and therefore there is less wastage in the form of rents and unearned incomes, because whatever money is being generating is directly lining the pockets of a dictator and the dictator's inner circle, right? And therefore there is less waste. So from a theoretical economic point of view, there's less waste. On the other hand, I would say that those rents that are going directly to the dictator are in fact robbing the citizens of a country from profiting from some of those gains and some of those economic gains, right? And that in itself is a huge disadvantage. But from a purely economic perspective, you could make the argument that there is less waste in an authoritarian regime versus a democratic regime. These are just some theoretical arguments that I wanted to put out there. Okay, moving on though, I think what's happening currently, we have to take into account the impact that the pandemic has had on making people more prone to authoritarianism. We need to take into account the impact that social media of late has had on and tools of digital authoritarianism have had. And the third I would talk about is the rise of authoritarian populism and this authoritarian tendency that has become this latent authoritarian tendency that has become a lot more overt amongst voters of democratic regimes. So let's go through these 3 points. The pandemic, I think, brought to light maybe some weaknesses of democratic regimes and the weaknesses of political institutions. In that, and one of the political institutions that I think was hardest hit during the pandemic was transparency, right? Where even in democratic regimes, Freedom House itself has noted that the obscuring of data or this sowing misinformation by democratic regimes like the United States has not helped develop the trust and confidence of voters within democracies at all. By the same token, I think because of social media and because of having information at your fingertips, people have been able to see authoritarian regimes like Singapore, like China, handle the pandemic in a far more effective way, in that they had their they had their testing centers up and ready to go very quickly. They distributed the vaccine very, very effectively and very quickly. Now, I'm not talking about whether or not those vaccines were the best ones or of the appropriate quality. The point that I'm trying to make is that it appeared on the face of it that these countries handled the pandemic far more efficiently than, say, some democratic regimes did, right? So I think the pandemic has had an impact on how much trust people have in their democratic institutions.
One question about the pandemic and authoritarian regimes. We've seen a lot of protests, even here in Canada, that because of the pandemic, our governments are no longer democratic, but are authoritarian, with mask mandates and people needing to be vaccinated and to show proof of vaccination to enter restaurants, and in some cases in order to keep their jobs. Is part of the appeal not just that authoritarian regimes are seen to be more effective in responding, but that there's at least a perception, and tell me if there's some reality to this, that even democratic countries have become more authoritarian in response to this global pandemic.
Now, isn't that interesting, right? I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is, in fact, a double-edged sword, right? Like a lot of these things cut both ways, right? In order to be a lot more effective and efficient in their decision-making, people are making the accusation that democratic regimes have become more authoritarian, that they're imposing vaccine mandates and that these mandates are against people's individual freedoms and so on. Part of the problem is that democratic regimes have been unable to communicate the right message to their people at the right time during the pandemic, because there has been so much to deal with, so much to contend with. And it's not just the pandemic that governments are dealing with, they're dealing with other aspects of, domestic and foreign policy. And so, and so you're right. I mean, I think a lot of what I'm talking about and a lot of what you have just observed, yes, it is cut both ways, unfortunately. And what it has ended up doing is eroding the trust of people in their public institutions. Right now, while the trust in public institutions has been eroding, you've got social media and you've got the internet. So let's talk about what exactly has happened there. Now, look, information technologies had been envisioned as a tool to enhance government and liberty. But again, I think information technology cuts both ways and is a bit of a double edged sword in that those same tools of information technology have been misused by authoritarian states like China and Russia. And in fact, some would argue by democratic regimes themselves. So, disinformation, corporate espionage, surveillance techniques, election interference by a number of these authoritarian states, what I would call their digital authoritarian toolkit, is allowing the internet to become fragmented in a way that advantages the authoritarian states. And how that is contributing to a rise in authoritarianism around the world, or rather the attraction towards authoritarian states around the world, is that the internet is being used to decrease trust in public institutions. It is being used to increase social and political control. It is co-opting, it is corrupting foundational principles of democracy. And the idea is not to break democracy, to destroy democracy, but to redefine it and reshape it to the advantage of these authoritarian countries, such as Russia, China, Iran, and so on. Now, social media has made it possible for consumers of social media to exist in silos and to communicate with those who agree with your own ideological disposition. So if you are falling prey to some of these misinformation campaigns, if you are falling prey to information presented on the internet that is advantaging authoritarian tendencies, then unfortunately, because of how social media is designed to keep you within that silo, keep you communicating with individuals who believe in the same things that you do, is allowing us to become even more, I would say, isolated in our thinking and fragmented, and eroding further trust in democratic political institutions. Now, combine this with this rise, these populist tendencies around the globe that we have seen, and this emergence, or rather, I would say, the manifestation of this latent authoritarian tendencies amongst people. Now, we've been talking about Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Erdogan in Turkey, Narendra Modi in India, Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil as authoritarian populists. Now, what exactly have these leaders been doing? They were all democratically elected in free and fair elections, legitimate elections, all right? And slowly over time, they have eroded trust in democratic political institutions. Slowly over time, they have displayed more and more authoritarian tendencies towards their own citizenry. And so the question is, what exactly and why exactly are democratic voters supporting these individuals? And part of what's happening, I think, is explained by a cultural backlash to long-term ongoing social change within Western societies. I think there has been a cultural backlash to secular values, tolerance for diversity, LGBT rights, same-sex marriages. I mean, these are all threatening cultural values, and voters in these societies fear being left behind because they can't seem to wrap their heads around the social changes that have been going on over the last 30, 40 years. Now, the question you should be asking is, why are voters desirous of a strongman leader? Why do they want an authoritarian leader? What is the charm? What is the interest here?
Yeah, and if we go back, that's kind of, I asked like what causes people to reject democracy and embrace
Exactly.
authoritarian figures. So that's actually like
Exactly.
we've come right back to what the core of my original question is like why do people embrace that? Because you listed four or five leaders that, as you say,
Yeah.
democratically elected, they were free and fair, but India, Turkey, Brazil, Hungary, Poland, all of these countries had legitimate elections, and the leaders and the governments have eroded those foundations of have eroded the democratic foundations of the country and the institutions that protect it.
So, what I want to say in response to this is that what these leaders have successfully tapped into is the psychological profile of their voters who, under the right conditions, desire extreme policies and seek a strongman leader to implement them. The conditions that I am talking about are the conditions that I just described in this very long-winded way. The pandemic, the digital authoritarianism, the fragmentation of the internet, the rise of social media. I think all of these things have come together in a way, in a climate of economic uncertainty, in a climate of ongoing social change that is threatening people's cultural values. All right. And it has manifested these latent authoritarian tendencies amongst people, which is to say that voters perceive a moral threat. They want to immediately lock down borders. They want to kick out the other. They want to punish anyone who is morally deviant or decadent in a way that is not matching their social reality. They therefore want social order to be brought back. They want hierarchy in what they are seeing and perceiving to be an extremely chaotic world. And what they want, therefore, is forceful, decisive action against all that is a threat. And if you go back to what I started this answer off with, the one advantage that authoritarian regimes have over a democratic regime is that authoritarian regimes can make unilateral decisions very forcefully, very effectively, very quickly, often violently. And that is being unearthed by some of these authoritarian populists around the world.
Okay, so what can people do? Winston Churchill famously said that no one pretends democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. So, assuming that you would agree with this sentiment, what can governments and individuals, voters, citizens do to protect democratic institutions to attacks from within when some folks want to embrace extreme policies, and attacks from without with the social media disinformation campaigns that are often run from foreign sources? What can we do to protect democratic norms and institutions?
I mean, the one thing I would say, and I think this is a pretty obvious answer, we need to safeguard legitimate elections, right? On both the government's part and also the voters, we need to safeguard legitimate elections. We need to ensure that everyone has the right to vote. Okay, something that is quite threatened in the United States of America, and they're struggling to pass their voting rights acts. And in the meantime, the Republican Party has really redistricted and gerrymandered electoral districts in a way that would actually advantage them in all subsequent House and Senate elections. My point is that we need to protect people's right to vote. We need to safeguard legitimate elections. We need to safeguard and protect the electoral result and certify the electoral result when it comes out. I believe for a democracy to work, the loser has to consent to the election result, and the loser needs to then step back, sit in the opposition, and hold the government accountable instead of causing a ruckus. And as we're seeing in the United States of America, the ex-president consistently saying that the election was stolen from him, right? So that's point number one. Second, I would say, and this is, again, a strategy that has to be both bottom up and top down. We need to enhance citizen preparedness. We need to make sure that citizens are aware of how vulnerable they are to misinformation and disinformation campaigns on social media, on the internet. We need to ensure that the right information is reaching citizens, and that is a responsibility that to a certain extent rests with the media, that tends to have an agenda setting role in a democracy, with a media that holds the government accountable, and holds truth to power. I think that from the government's point of view, citizen preparedness is part of a strategy to ensure that citizens are aware of who the candidates are, what the candidates stand for, and to make sure that citizens who are vulnerable to disinformation campaigns are protected. And that, of course, involves, I think, all aspects of governance, including intelligence agencies and election commissions around the world, to make sure that elections are managed properly and well. The third thing, of course, is to combat foreign interference. Like I said, one of the principles that we have to stand for in this world, it's a norm, is sovereignty. I think both internal and external sovereignty of nations needs to be protected, and it needs to be upheld. We have to combat foreign interference in elections if we want to protect our democracy from the tools that authoritarian states like Russia and China are using digitally to interfere in elections around the world. I think these are three things that we can certainly do in order to protect our democracy. But then a fourth one, that's an important one, is that we need to look beyond just ourselves. You see, when we say that liberalism and democracy, liberalism as an ideology and democracy is as a system of governance is the best that we have, because all the other options are worse. I think we need to be a little less determinist as well at the same time. And we need to look beyond our own self-interest, and we need to look out for each other. I think we need to look beyond self-interest. We need to look beyond individual gain. We need to think about the collective. We need to think about the community, and we need to think about building bridges. We need to think about building social capital within our communities if we want to protect democracy. And as citizens within a country, I think that is recognizing that individual self-interest at the expense of all others is not the way forward. I think that is an integral part of building a democracy as well.
Yeah, I think that hits on something crucial there. And especially in the pandemic, we've seen a tension between what is best, or at least what is most convenient for the individual. Like, nobody enjoys wearing masks. Like, it's not fun for anyone, but the benefit generally accrues to others. If I wear a mask, it very slightly, it's not nothing, but it only slightly reduces my risk of contracting COVID. But the benefit is that it is incredibly effective at preventing me from spreading it to anybody else. So if I wear a mask, it's to help my community, not to help me. And I think that you're right. There's a perspective that there's the only factor in the cost benefit calculation that people are doing in their mind is the self and not others. There's not the society and the communities in which we live. And I want when you were talking about safeguarding democracy, there was sort of two categories. You were talking about societal institutions protecting the vote, the legal aspects of it, and also cultural norms, the expectations and desires of the voters. And I want to kind of contrast the two for a moment, and then ask you to comment. So if you look at the United States on paper, like if you look at its constitution with the First Amendment and other laws, it is a very secular nation. There is the separation of church and state, which is very clearly in there. And yet an open atheist would find it nearly impossible to win any elected office in the United States and Canada, in the United States of America. Whereas in Canada, we in this nation mention God explicitly in both the preamble of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is our Constitution, and in our national anthem. But anybody who explicitly touts their faith and repeatedly on the campaign trail would be considered like at best gauche or and possibly harm significantly their chances of winning. This is true in other countries as well. In Pakistan, blasphemy is a capital offense, but the state has never executed anyone for blasphemy. But at least 75 people accused of blasphemy, even if not charged by the state, but accused by someone of blasphemy, or their defender, someone who's defended someone accused of blasphemy, have been murdered, including two high-profile assassinations. There was the governor of Punjab and the federal minister for minority affairs, both assassinated by a mob. So, sometimes the societal institutions say one thing, the cultural norms say another. And can you talk about the interplay between the two and which wins out and which should win out, and how we can make progress when like how can we create institutions that might change cultural norms the way we want, or how can we use cultural norms to change institutions in the way that we want, and how do we do it in the way that increases democracy and freedom and pluralism and cosmopolitanism, as opposed to going the other way and instituting more theocratic regimes, more authoritarian regimes, more regimes that deny, for example, religious minorities or LGBT individuals their rights and freedoms.
Right. So when we think about the interplay between societal institutions and cultural norms, we need to look at the democratization literature in political science and see where exactly these political culture arguments are stemming from, right? So back in the 1960s, 1970s, there was a very popular argument that was made by Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verba, which said that a high level of civic culture is going to result in a democratic society, a democratic form of governance. And essentially, civic culture was defined as being composed of three elements. The first one being high civic engagement, the idea that individuals living in a society are interested in participating in elections, they are willing to protest, to ensure that their civil and political rights are protected, and they participate in large part in political and public discourse. The second element is, of course, the principle of political equality, the idea that civic and political rights of all citizens are protected equally under the law of the land. The third element, and this is an important one, is solidarity. The idea that there's a high level of general trust and respect among citizens. The idea that people respect and trust each other's cultural norms, and that there is a tolerance for diversity within a society. This principle of solidarity. Now, while when I'm explaining what the concept of civic culture is, you can start to see intuitively that, yeah, of course, high levels of civic culture would result in a highly democratic form of society, because good things go together, and these two things go together. The problem, I think, with this argument and the way that it has been critiqued in the literature is that, well, what comes first? Does the civic culture precede democracy, or does democracy come and therefore the civic culture follows? Right? And it's one of those chicken or egg kind of questions. Well, which one comes first, and which way should the causal arrow point in, right? And that is the difficulty of this interplay between societal institutions, political culture, and democracy. Now, you brought up a really, really interesting example. Let's take a look at Pakistan, for example. Now, in the case of Pakistan, you're absolutely right. This is a country that has one of the strictest blasphemy laws in the world. And very simply, the law states that it is criminal to insult founders of any religious community. Now, in Pakistan, obviously, Pakistan is the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and therefore, this is a country that came into existence in the name of Islam. It is home to about 90% Muslims, and Pakistan, of course, inherits this penal code that I just talked. That includes the blasphemy law from the British. It is the British who, in fact, had put in this blasphemy law in the criminal code that was followed when the British were colonizing the Indian subcontinent. And when Pakistan comes into being, it inherits this law. Now, post 1947, post independence, Pakistan has raised the ante, and in fact, leaders in Pakistan have made this law even more harsh and even more strict, and even more severe. And any counter to this law is resisted by a sect of Muslims, the Barelvis in particular, right? That are that claim that any insult to Prophet Muhammad um, would is blasphemy, regardless of whether the person supposedly blaspheming is a Muslim, is a non-Muslim, is a believer of a monotheistic faith, or a believer of any other type of faith. Now, what exactly am I highlighting over here? The fact that within a country like Pakistan, which is quite homogenous, and the fact that it has a 90% Muslim population, right? Almost 90 to 95% Muslim population, respect for a fellow citizen of Pakistan is lacking when it comes to this very principle of whether or not you can utter blasphemous words against the leader of the Islamic faith, the Prophet Muhammad. So when I talk about solidarity as being an element of civic culture, well, it is highly lacking. It is lacking in that even Muslims residing in Pakistan don't see eye to eye on what exactly Islam is and how exactly Islam should be practiced in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Now, this takes me to another question. It takes me to another thing. Is Islam antithetical to democracy? Should we be considering that or thinking about that when we make a political culture argument, right? When we say that civic culture precedes democratization, well then, is Islam as a political culture of a land antithetical to democracy? Now, very quick answer to that. I mean, Gallup and Pew polls that have been conducted in Muslim majority states around the world note that Muslims do not see any contradiction between Islam and democracy. Number one. Number two, they neither support a theocratic regime where Sharia is the law, that where Islamic law is the constitutional principle by which the country is governed, or in a secular state. Instead, what a lot of these Muslims are looking for is a model where democratic institutions can coexist with Islam. So I go back to that same thing. What exactly is the causal mechanism, and how are we thinking about civic culture? And when we make these kinds of arguments, I think they're highly context specific. Right? We're talking about Canada and the United States on the continent of North America, and look at how different the religion plays as a wedge issue in both countries' politics. I think it is hard sometimes to make these really, really clear generalizations of causal mechanisms that explain, what the interplay between political culture and democracy are, when in fact how cultures are practiced and how cultural norms come to be and how they end up impacting the governance of a country can be quite remarkably different. I mean, take the example of Indonesia, right? Indonesia is has had an authoritarian past, mind you, under Suharto, but has emerged as a democracy and is very much a country where Islam is the principal religion of most of its population. And so, then our political, what I want to say is, how much sway do political cultural arguments have when we think about democratic norms. Um, and other political cultural arguments have been made. I mean, you gave the example of Pakistan, which is why I jumped on Islam and democracy. And there are
Well,
academics who will say that, well, look at the Islamic world, look at the Middle East, it's almost all authoritarian. Look, yes, but just because you've got this one mixed bag of cases, does it mean that it's antithetical in other parts of the world?
yeah, I mean, my perspective is that there's no conflict between Islam and democracy, but there is definitely a conflict between a theocracy and democracy. And
Certainly not the same thing.
whether your theocracy is Christian or Hindu or Muslim, you're not going to be able to sustain democratic principles and a theocracy. I'm a big fan of a secular democracy where the rule of law is paramount and government is neutral in matters of religion. I'm not looking for the state to be anti-theistic or to suppress religious expression, but to allow people to be whatever religion they like and allow that. Uh, and but yes, if you are theocratic in nature, then you're going to definitely have problems being democratic. I'm trying to remain optimistic, and you seem to be fairly optimistic about the state of democracy. So I want you to try and convince me. So if we look at the globe's most populous nation, China, it's a one-party authoritarian state. It makes no real pretense of being even marginally democratic, despite tiny little elections that are held in there. It's not a democracy in any meaningful way. Now, the next four countries by population are all very different. India, the United States, Indonesia, and Pakistan. What they have in common is that all of them have had their democratic norms and institutions eroded in recent years. And I fear that democracy is waning today. And I would like you, if you disagree with me, to convince me that this assessment is too pessimistic, because between just those five countries, we're dealing with nearly a third, or possibly even slightly over a third, of the world's population.
Right. So, just in the way you're phrasing the question, I'm just going to take this as an opportunity to argue yes and no. So,
You are a professor.
right. Exactly. So now, is democracy on decline? Right. That's the question. I'm going to say yes, it is. All right. I'm going to make the following arguments. For 16 consecutive years, there has been a decline in global freedom. This is what Freedom House reported in its Democracy Under Siege report of 2021, right? And then in 2022, they followed up by saying, well, authoritarianism is certainly on the rise. Freedom House has also noted that 38% of the population, global population, lives in not free countries, while only 20% of the global population lives in free countries. And some would say that free in the Freedom House Index refers to the Western democratic states. Now, The Economist has done similar analysis, and back in 2020, they noted that the democracy index had fallen from 5.44 to 5.37. What those numbers exactly mean, we'd have to refer to the index itself, but that it has been the worst since 2006, since when the democracy index has been in place. Now, what these institutions, The Economist, Freedom House, other indices around the world, you mentioned, I believe, another report which said that the autocrats are winning. I mean, there's good reasons to make these kinds of claims. I mean, after all, what we're observing in countries that should be beacons of democracy, we're seeing a substantial amount of decline. So the world's largest democracy by population, India, under Narendra Modi, has seen significant decline in internet freedom and judicial independence, the citizenship law that Narendra Modi tried to pass. I mean, definitely clamping down on civic and political rights of citizens within India. But then we tend to forget that India has never really been a liberal democracy in the way we think of Canada, or the way we think of, or we used to think of the United States of America. India is very much an electoral democracy. And by being an electoral democracy, India very much holds a legitimate, free, and fair election that brings about a transfer of power and multi party governance in India. And on that, India is doing just fine. There will be another election in 4 or 5 years within India. And we'll see who wins, whether it's Narendra Modi, who emerges even more of a strong man in India, or someone else. So there is some rot within democracies, okay? And we can certainly see that rot within the United States during the Donald Trump presidency. And we're trying to and the US is trying to get out of that under Joe Biden. And there's certainly been a change in tone, I would say. Now, at the same time, other reasons, anti-democratic alliances that are being formed around the world. Okay, the alliance between Russia and China, I cannot say this enough. It is a dangerous alliance, and the fact that China is the one country that is not necessarily coming out against Russia with the same severity that Western democracies and NATO countries have is troubling, to say the least. Um, we have also at the same time seen a number of coups and power grabs in countries like Nicaragua, Tunisia, Mali, Iran, Myanmar, all very troubling signs. And then the fourth factor, that a number of countries around the world are making a pretense of competitive elections. Are those elections truly competitive? Are they truly multi-party elections? Are they truly free and fair? And take Russia, case in point. I mean, 90% approval rating, 90% of voter turnout in a country like Russia, where clearly people are protesting the governance. The government, Putin's government. I mean, what exactly is happening in these hybrid regimes? So yes, it seems that autocrats are creating a more favorable international environment for themselves, and they are and that the nature of authoritarianism that we're seeing in the world today is significantly different from what we saw back in the 1950s, 1960s. Autocrats today are acting in a way so as to improve the lives of their population, so that they can attract these populations to authoritarianism. This is a marked shift in the way authoritarianism is being practiced around the world. Authoritarian leaders today are more interested in performance legitimacy, which is the principle, I would say, behind China's success as an authoritarian state, despite having had all this economic prosperity for the last 30, 40 years. So it's a marked shift. So on the one hand, we see all of these troubling signs, and we can make the argument that authoritarianism is on the rise, the autocrats are winning. But I do want to quote from that same report that Freedom House made, Democracy Under Siege. And I think it is a very, very important quote. Democracy is beleaguered, but not defeated. Its enduring popularity in a more hostile world are signals of its perseverance, right? And so that takes me to the second half of my answer, which is that no, democracy is not in decline. And it is not in decline for the following reasons. Where exactly are we seeing this decline? Typically speaking, we would think intuitively that the decline would be in the newer democracies, in the less consolidated democracies. But that's not where we've seen the decline. We've actually seen the decline in established democracies, right? And even though we have seen this kind of decline, it's interesting that democracy has survived in inhospitable conditions. Inhospitable conditions that have been identified by political scientists, where there have been weak political institutions, where there are tutelary reserves and domains of power, where there's a lot of ethnic diversity, where populations are not necessarily solidified in the same way that civic cultural arguments would tend to specify. Yes, there has been a decline, about a 5 to 10% decline, but compared to what the situation was back in 1970, there is an upward trend, and there are many more democracies in the world than there ever have been in in history. There's nonetheless a dramatic increase if you take a more longitudinal perspective, a longer time span to see what exactly the trend has been. The trend has been upward, number one. Number two, I want to say that even though a number of Western democracies have been discredited, the United States being, the case in point, um, and the fact that people don't necessarily want to abide by every principle of liberalism, every principle of capitalism, every principle of democracy, um, and that in equal measure, people do not necessarily want to abide by free market, rule of law, respect for human rights, respect for civic and political rights, and so on. For the most part, people are still very much interested in participating in elections. People still want to go out there and cast a vote. And the idea of a competitive election to throw out a bad leader or a bad government holding powerful players to account is still very much something that citizens around the world desire. After all, look at the protests in Hong Kong, look at the protests in Belarus. Granted, these protests haven't gone far, but look at the desire that people have for democratic political institutions. Look at the desire that people have for elections. Look at the protests in Bolivia. Look at the protests in Chile, albeit not an authoritarian context. Look at the protests in Iran. And these are all protests that have happened in the last 2-3 years, right? I'm talking about 2019, 2020, 2021. There is still a desire for democratic political institutions. And then let's also think about migratory patterns. Where are people migrating from? And where are they going exactly? They're going in the direction of democratic states, right? People are still migrating to the West. People still believe in what liberal democracy can offer them as an opportunity for improving their lot in life.
Let me push back a little bit on those two
Yeah.
things, because I want to be convinced, but I'm not yet. So you've got a little bit more work to do. So you mentioned the protests in various countries, and those are all very, very true and accurate. But what that leaves out is there are protests in all of the Western democracies as well. France is regularly crippled. The nation is brought to a standstill by protests of various kinds. In the United States and Canada, I mean, we had truckers blockade borders and shut down the downtown core of Ottawa for nearly 3 weeks, and that was just in the past month. Democracies are experience huge protests at times as well, and sometimes it's on any number of range of issues, and sometimes it's against some of these more democratic moves that governments are making. And the second aspect that you brought up of the migratory patterns, you can argue that you're arguing that people are moving towards democratic countries, and whereas observationally that's true, my question to you is, are people moving to largely Western nations because they're democratic, or is it more of an economic move where they're moving towards wealthier countries where they can improve their lifestyle and their quality of life? And those are obviously related factors, but I'm wondering if you believe that it's the democratic regime that they're moving to that is dominant, or whether it's the economic opportunity that is dominant. So those are the two things that I want to say. You haven't convinced me yet, but I would like you to. So please, please
I
continue.
think I think I think the migration patterns are in equal measure both economic, driven by economy, and driven by politics. And I think both are important to look at. And I would say that a democratic society allows you to make the most of your wealth as well, simply because a lot of these democratic states are also following principles of open and free market economies that are a lot more, how should I say, open to creative thinking, open to creative destruction, open to innovation in ways that authoritarian contexts where similar economic principles are not necessarily bearing the same kind of fruit of people's labor. And so I think it is a bit of both, and they're interconnected. And I would say that depending on where you're migrating from, whether if you're migrating from an authoritarian state towards a more democratic state, I think very often it is because also you're looking for freedom, political freedoms, and not just economic freedoms. After all, what this crisis in Ukraine is also going to create is a whole host of refugees, and we have reports suggesting that 500,000 people have already fled Ukraine. Right now they're fleeing an authoritarian attack, and they're moving towards, they're seeking political refuge and political freedom. So that's to answer that point. But the second thing I would say is, just because there's protests happening in democracies, and just because democracies are having to face up to certain challenges right now, and just because democracies are having to deal with, in equal measure, apathetic voters and voters who at the same time are up in arms because they feel like their cultural values and their political values are being threatened, does not necessarily mean that democracy in and of itself as a process is bad. Sometimes good processes can result in outcomes that are less than expected. And just because a democracy is challenged and is having to face up to those challenges, as we are seeing happen in Canada with the truckers, as you mentioned, or as the United States has had to deal with, an ex-president who refuses to stop talking about his electoral loss, doesn't mean that individuals around the world cannot have faith in the processes of democracy to help them get rid of bad governments from time to time and holding governments accountable. So I guess we go back to the quote that Winston Churchill that you quoted Winston Churchill from having, that at this point in time, I mean, we have to have faith also in understanding that politics is cyclical. Economics is also cyclical. There are cycles of boom and bust, but politics in equal measure is also cyclical. And from time to time, different political regimes around the world are going to get challenged. And those challenges appear in the form of protests. And right now, as I said earlier on in this conversation as well, democracy is challenged, and Freedom House has noticed that democracy is beleaguered. It doesn't mean that the processes of democracy are bad and that people have entirely lost faith in those processes of democracy. I think that I think that our governments and our leaders in democratic states have to work a lot harder to satisfy their citizens and to meet their citizens at the same on the same page that their citizens are at. I think that is necessary. But that is democracy. You're holding your governments accountable. And that is what public discourse sometimes looks like. Protest is, the right to express and having the freedom to express what it is that you are demanding against a government that is legitimately elected. Yes, France comes to a standstill, but then at the same time, the Gilets jaunes did manage to come to the table and work with Macron to end the conflict at the same time. So, like I said, I think people still believe that democracy can work. It is challenged right now. I give you that. It is beleaguered. I give you that. And it is a little bit in trouble right now. I give you that. But is it done for? I'm not sure. And I don't think that's the case.
All right. I've got one last question for you. If we look back to the Arab Spring protests from just a few years ago, it led to some countries instituting at least cosmetic democratic reforms, but they don't really seem to have taken root. Former Soviet republics gained independence about 30 years ago, but overall, there doesn't really seem to have been a large move towards democracy in those relatively young nations. Thailand elected its first leader in 1988, but it's experienced several coups in since then. And even if you go back to 1945, when Turkey became a multi-party democracy, there have been 3 military coups since 1945 and 1 attempted coup just a few years ago in 2016. My question is, as we move, and hopefully you're right, that we are part of a broad trend from authoritarianism to democratic nations, how long does it take to establish a democracy, for the roots to take hold, so that it becomes part of the nation's conception of itself?
This is not an easy question, and certainly for a political scientist, really really difficult to give you an exact number as to how long it would take.
I'm not expecting 15.7 years, and
Exactly right.
by the time you hit your 16th birthday, boom, you're a democracy. But what goes into that calculation? How can you tell if if reforms are merely cosmetic, or getting into the heart of how a nation
Right.
defines itself? Thailand's had
Absolutely.
several military coups,
Mhm.
but it's kind of unthinkable that Canada would have a military coup, despite what the numerous problems that we do have in this country.
Absolutely. And look, it's a hard question, and there's a good reason for it being a hard question, which is that, political scientists have dedicated their entire careers to try, come up with a good solid answer to this question. I mean, democratization is hard. It's a complicated process, and it is a very context specific process, right? Which is why it is very difficult for political scientists to come up with generalizations as to how these processes of democratization would
So
occur.
when you say context specific, what you mean is, like, what might have worked in Brazil or what might have worked in Chile would not work in Iran or Pakistan, and that Japan had an entirely different way of coming to being a democratic. Is that what you mean by context
Absolutely.
specific?
Yes, that is
Okay.
exactly what I mean. That a whole host of variables are context specific and not necessarily replicable in all cases everywhere in the world. I mean, let's think about some of these variables, right? I mean, we would consider whether or not democratization as a process is top down. Has it been brokered and crafted by political elites, individuals who are in power, who are not necessarily taking into account whether or not there is even a constituency for democracy within a context? Do the people of the country subscribe to the so-called democratic vision that is being imposed upon them top down? And that takes me to another point. I mean, what about international influence? Is democracy is democracy coming about as a result of certain tools of democracy promotion that have been successful, or is it coming about because it has been externally imposed upon a country internationally, like what the United States tried to do in Afghanistan and Iraq, and failed quite badly? Is democracy the result of political culture prerequisites, as we discussed earlier in this conversation? Is it the result of socioeconomic prerequisites, aka the modernization theory that a population has to reach a certain economic threshold before it can transform itself to demand democracy? I mean, there's so many different variables that are at play when we think about democratization. But I think what makes the transition to democracy particularly hard, and this is the key moment as for me that is crucial, can a country make can a country go from just transitioning to actually start consolidating? And I think this gets to the heart of your question, right? When is it that we can say that a country is now a democracy and not so much one that is just transitioning, right? And it's that consolidation phase that I think that political scientists have to do a lot more work to figure out what exactly it takes for a country to become democratic in this phase of consolidation. Some of the things I would say include the strengthening of political institutions such that they become the only game in town. To get things done in a country when democratic institutions democratic political institutions are the only way to get things done. And when they're the only game in town, that's when a country has consolidated its democracy. Now, does that mean that a consolidated democracy cannot waver and revert back towards its transition phase and then onwards to authoritarianism? Of course it can. It can happen. But if the political institutions are strong enough, they are likely to hold, right? So one of the things that in the wake of the 2020 election in the United States, people touted a lot was that, oh, democratic political institutions in America held up, and look, Joe Biden's election was in fact certified and he did become the president of the United States. Look, democracy works. Okay, but we came close. We
Yeah.
came very, very close. There was an insurrection on the Capitol, right? And so the point that I want to make is that democracy can be long lasting. It doesn't mean that it is permanent. And I think that citizens need to be aware that if they want to live under the norms of democracy, they need to protect democratic principles. Number one, they need to they must want those principles enough to fight for them, to protect them, and to safeguard them. And that's what makes a democracy long lasting. We can talk the big game about political freedoms, but without recognizing that social solidarity and the collective also matters. And I think the
Hmm.
pandemic has made this very, very obvious and clear to all of us. We don't hold together as a community. We don't hold together as a democratic state, a nation and state, and I think that is important. So I guess that takes me to my third point. We talked about transition, we talked about consolidation, but very often we forget to talk about quality. What exactly is the quality of democracy that we are trying to preserve, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and actually, that's something we haven't really emphasized, but I think is actually important, is that it's not a binary. It's not a you meet a certain number of criteria and boom, you weren't a democracy before, but and you are now. It's
yes.
a continuum. It's a spectrum, and so there's more democratic and there's less democratic, but there's
Mhm.
any point that we say, okay, and now you're a democracy is an arbitrary point, kind of like when we say that you are an adult, right? There's not a magic point when you turn 18
Right.
that you're an adult, and that at 19 you can drink, at least in Ontario. And in Quebec
Right.
they make it 18, and in the States generally drinking age is 21, but
Yeah.
at 16 you can drive a car. Like, I'm glad
Right.
that we don't have 5-year-olds driving, and I'm glad that we don't wait
Right.
until people are 30 before they can vote and drive a car. But whatever age it is that where we have that demarcation, it's arbitrary, because growing up and
Right.
maturing is a spectrum. And I think that demo, assessing the health of one's democracy, or a determination whether a nation is a democracy, is similar in that respect, that it is a spectrum, and that you can't, it's not a binary determination that you are or are not a democratic nation.
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Look, there is a time and place for dichotomous measures of democracy. There's a time and place for binaries, right? We need to have a cutoff as to when we're going to allow people to start drinking, or when we're going to start allowing people
Mm-hmm.
to vote. For example, we need those cutoffs, and they're useful in some ways. By the same token, there is place in political science research for dichotomous measures of democracy, when we need to be able to do statistical analysis of which countries around the world are democracies and which countries are authoritarian. Now, no two measures of democracy, or no two indices of democracy are alike, right? I mean, you can compare the data from The Economist to Freedom House to Polity4 to Varieties of Democracy, VDEM, and honestly, the map of the world for each and every one of these looks quite different, for the simple reason that politics is extremely complex, and sometimes not everything can be thought of as being a binary. You're either a
Yes.
democracy or you're not. No, it's very, very hard to say that, because there is the possibility, like you said, you use the word continuum. I really like that word, for the simple reason that yes, there's some states that are less democratic than others, right? And they are on a spectrum. In the same way that I think that political regimes are on a multidimensional spectrum. If we just take elections, for example, we can plot where different countries around the world fit on just that dimension of legitimate, free, and fair elections. But then those same states might actually be closer to authoritarian because even though they're holding meaningful elections, they're not actually protecting the civic and political rights of all their citizens in equal measure. Case in point, India. So, is India a democracy or not? Now, you and I probably agree that yes, India is a democracy, but is it a lesser democracy, or is it a, or where exactly does it lie in the spectrum is a matter of interpretation, right? Which is why these indexes don't look alike. They all vary from one to another based on the criteria that they're looking at, based on the variables that they're measuring, and how they're measuring them, and who is interpreting those variables for them. That is why political science is not an exact science in the same way that we would expect the natural sciences to be. And therefore, I think, I guess I want to leave our listeners with a sense of understanding that the world is a complex place, and we try to make sense of it all the time as political scientists, as observers of political reality, as individuals who are consuming the news every single day. And I think we can get caught up in all of this information that we're consuming all the time. And I do think that we need to recognize that politics is cyclical. There is such a thing as world historical time. And we need to recognize the challenges of our day and recognize that, yes, democracy has weakened. But is it over for democracy? No, not yet. Are people around the world still fighting for democracy? Yes, they are. And are people around the world going to try and protect the institutions of democracy? Yes, they are. Is it still the best system? I don't like using the word best, but it's certainly what we've got. And it's certainly the regime type that is protecting the so-called freedoms that we have come to love so much. So I think people need to be sensible consumers of the information that they're receiving on a daily basis as well.
Well, Mariam Mufti, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Any final thoughts that you would like to leave our listeners with?
No matter what you believe is going on in the world, and no matter what you think of your respected governments, I think we need to we need to fight for and protect the principles of democracy, if that is what we believe to be the most equitable, the most desirous form of government that we would like to see in our country. And since this is the Canadian podcast for Inquiry, I'm speaking directly to Canadians. I mean, if we believe in democracy and we desire a democratic government, then we need to safeguard the institutions of democracy. And as citizens of Canada, that is both a right and a responsibility of every citizen in Canada. And I think we should take that responsibility seriously.
I wholeheartedly agree. This has been wonderful. I think that several of people might want to learn more about your thoughts and your writings if they wanted to. Is there a way for our listeners to find out about your writings, your research? Do you have a social media that you would like to share? How can people find you online?
Absolutely. So people can just look me up on the University of Waterloo's website. I have a webpage that is dedicated to my research, to selected publications, to the work that I'm doing, and I'd love to hear any feedback that your listeners might have.
All right. Mariam Mufti, thank you so much for appearing on Podcast for Inquiry today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We rely entirely on donations to be your voice supporting science, free inquiry, critical thinking, and secularism here in Canada. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centreforinquiry.ca/donate or becoming a member for only $30 per year at centreforinquiry.ca/join. Your support will help make it possible for us to continue making our collective demand for reason and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centreforinquiry.ca. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Matt Payne, Nikolay Nikitushkin, and Martin Zelinsky. Music by Anthony Luzaro. See you next time.